What's the biggest culture shock you have ever experienced? I grew up in a relatively poor neighborhood. A lot of rough stuff going on there, but we won't discuss all of it. Suffice to say, even at a young age, I was pretty sure I'd seen some crap. In middle school, I made friends with a kid that lived in the trailer park across town. The trailer park kids are a whole different type of poor. I remember the kid I was friends with as soon as I got there goes, "Let's go to the creek, Darius got his fishing pole back." Okay, whatever the hell that means. So we go down to the creek and there's this kid, Darius, and he's fishing in a creek. And there's about 12 kids standing around watching him. Every so often he's catching a fish and handing it to one of the kids, and the kid is taking the fish and running off giddy as hell. He finally catches one and hands it to my friend. He and I skip off back to his trailer. My friend takes the fish as is, puts it in the microwave, and then when the microwave beeps, he takes it out and starts eating it with a fork. I almost puked. We now have a Discord. Check out the server in the link in the description. Story 2. Rock concerts in Japan. You have a number on your ticket and everyone queues according to that number. Yes, they managed to queue hundreds of people in front of a venue according to the order in which they bought their ticket. It's fair. If you buy your ticket early, you can get the chance for a better spot, and you have a chance to buy limited merch that is usually sold out within minutes. When the venue opens, they call out every number, and as soon as yours is called, you can go in. They do it every time. They do that at small venues with 20 people waiting, and they do that at festivals. Another thing, even after 2 days of festival, the venue is clean as hell. Not one water bottle, not one wrapping paper, or anything. I was at Summer Sonic, Fuji Rock, and Osaka Met Rock, and it was clean everywhere. Story 3. Weirdly enough, it was returning to America after spending years abroad in Albania. Albania didn't have any international food chains or restaurants. Everything was local and usually tasted great. I think what it was for me was when I was going to Albania, I psyched myself up. I knew I was going to a foreign country and that things would be different, and they were. Most stores were no bigger than the size of my bedroom back home. Open-air street markets were common and roadside shops were everywhere. Most people didn't own vehicles and walked or relied on public transit. But when I returned to America, I was just going home, so I didn't think much of it. But after several years, it was weird. The day after returning home, we went to a Costco. Walking around that place on that day was one of the most surreal experiences in my life. Packages of food were huge and there was so much of everything. We drove our cars everywhere and I realized my little hometown didn't even have a proper bus system. That was easily my biggest culture shock, and it was about my own. Now think of anyone from a country like Albania coming to America for the first time. It's astonishing these people's heads don't just explode. The big box stores alone are insane. I can hardly believe it. Story 4. Just going to the USA and seeing that the water in the toilets is so full. How am I supposed to crap without getting my butt wet? Also, NYC taxis will blare their horns at frickin' anything. Pedestrians still on the crossing 2 seconds after the light goes green, honk. Car in front of you gently brakes, honk. Bird in the road, honk. Bee in the car, honk. The street lights turn on, honk. They're super aggressive drivers. Story 5. So I'm Norwegian, but I went to New Zealand for a year. The culture shock for me was how open Kiwis talk, and how there's no such thing as stranger danger. And as a typical Norwegian introvert, it took a while to get used to. I would meet a stranger and they'd be breaking the touch barrier right away, and start talking about their cousin's rash and all their weekend plans. Even bigger shock returning to silent Norway. Story 6. When I was a kid, one of my mother's friends was a woman from a very tough background, who had left her husband because he used to hit her and her children. She had 3 children and was living in a 2-bedroom council flat in a tough part of Glasgow. My mom met her because they were both doing part-time university degrees as mature students. She was studying to get a teaching qualification. I became friends with one of this woman's kids when I was about 6 or 7. I'd go over to his house for the night sometimes, and we would generally wander around the local neighborhood, just doing what kids do. He always carried a rucksack and was always on the lookout for empty glass soda/alcohol bottles. If he saw one, he would grab it and stick it in the sack. After a while, I started bringing a rucksack alongside him, so when I visited, we could double up on glass bottle carrying capacity. The reason he did this was that in Glasgow back then, a sort of proto-recycling scheme meant that every one of those bottles was redeemable for 5 pence at any shop that sold them. They would collect them, give them out 5 pence per bottle, send them off to be recycled, and be reimbursed for their time by the local government. We'd collect a bunch of these, and then when we went back to his flat in the afternoon, my friend would proudly hand over a few quid in coins to his mother. He used to do this constantly, and it meant, this being the 1980s, a decent little earner to help pay for a bit of the household expenses and so on. I came from a family with a detached house in the suburbs that had 2 cars, 2 parents, 2 nice holidays a year, and no real worries when it came to money. Not rich, just lucky to be standard middle class. Meanwhile, this woman was raising 3 children by herself while studying to become a teacher in a tiny little damp flat in a bad part of town. She never asked her son to do what he did. He just took it upon himself, aged 7 or whatever, to go out and do it. It took me a while to understand what was happening, but once I did, I can honestly say it was one of the defining events of my life. This is an incredibly sweet story and the best kind of culture shock. I have no doubt that OP became a little bit of a better person learning this. Also, I probably said the name of the city wrong. Glasgow? I don't know. Those English city names always confuse me. Seeing the letters for something like Leicester and being like, oh yes, it's Leicester, breaks my brain. Hate it. Story 7. Not sure if it counts as a shock as much as a slow realization, because I've been going there all my life. But once I got to about 15 and visited Italy, I started getting asked out by guys who wouldn't take no for an answer. You reject a guy in the UK and they'll normally take it well, unless they're a bit unhinged. But in Italy, I said no to strangers, friends I'd known for years, people I'd met that night, all people who are otherwise normal, and they would be so persistent that I either had to leave or use my cousin as a fake boyfriend. Story 8. In India, we have a system of printing prices on each and everything on the box/packet of that thing. This includes everything from a tiny pack of gums to a giant refrigerator. Vendors cannot charge more than MSRP. They can charge less than that, though. Most of the big supermarkets and malls usually charge less than MSRP. However, in Europe, I've never seen this. Anyone can charge any price for anything. I've seen a pack of milk can be sold at 4 different prices in my nearby stores. In India, if a owner charges more than the MSRP, a consumer can lodge a complaint against them, and they can face serious consequences. Story 8. I grew up in a working-class city where passive-aggressiveness wasn't a thing. If people didn't like you, they made it obvious. Shouting matches and fistfights, common. Then I get a job at a snooty Ivy League university, and nobody expresses what they actually think or feel. Snide remarks replaced insults, and people quietly conspire against you while pretending to be your friend. Oh, and you can't call people out on their BS without getting socially shunned because everyone is neck-deep swimming in it. Story 10. I was born in Hawaii and lived on the Big Island until I was 6. Little me was used to wearing flip-flops or no shoes and lightweight dresses, or swimsuits or shorts and a t-shirt everywhere. It was too hot for anything else or it would just get dirty. Cut to my family moving to Ontario, Canada, about 3 hours north of Toronto. My dad was working in the vacation business, so we moved to an actual ski resort for the first few months. My sister and I were enrolled in Catholic school, and suddenly I had to wear clothes. Not just clothes, but stockings, jumpers, shirts with too many buttons, and shoes that had to shine. Coats, hats, gloves, different shoes to wear outside. 6-year-old me can't comprehend any of this. We even had to change for gym and then change back. My mom helped me put my stockings on in the morning, but after gym, I'd have to put them on myself. One day, my teacher called my mom to come get me because I decided to start some sort of anti-clothing revolution, and was jumping around the changing room in my underwear with my stockings on my head. Yeah, that must be really confusing for a kid. Like, all of a sudden you have to change everything you wear. And not just that, but like, kind of how you wear it too. Clothing holds a completely different connotation in a situation like that compared to somewhere like Hawaii. That's crazy. Judging by the last bit of that though, I'd say that OP handled it quite well. An anti-clothing revolution is just what that Catholic school needed, I bet. Story 11. I was born and raised in Peru, but left for the US in my early 20s. Despite things being far from rosy at the beginning, I was mostly pleasantly shocked. Drivers would stop for me if I was coming close to a street corner. Kids 18 years old were getting their own places with a friend or girlfriend. Weed smoking was so commonplace. In an hour of fast food work, I could make what I would usually make in a day back at the old birthplace. People were generally nice and polite, and they smile more often to strangers. Also, 2 2-inch bulletproof glasses at the counter at KFC in Pennsylvania, and they gave you your food via a revolving tray window. Moved down to Florida, and oh man, all that space and beautiful houses. Everyone has a car. My family could never afford one growing up, so I didn't even know how to drive. Supermarkets were fancy, and no one asks you to show your receipt when you're leaving, just in case you're stealing something. Got a job at a golf resort. Busser at a nice brunch place. So much food. My typical breakfast was 2 pieces of bread with margarine spread and instant coffee. Scrambled eggs were like for Sundays. These rich guys be having mimosas and eggs Benedict, pancakes the size of dinner plates with chocolate chips. Is this Narnia? Bathrooms in fancy hotels too. I would often start redesigning the place in my mind to turn it into my room. Back at the beginning, I was just fascinated with Walmart. Everything in the known universe is available, and often stuff and brands I considered rather in the luxury category would be cheaper than they were in Lima. After 12 years, I was recently forced to move back to Peru. I am convinced drivers are actually trying to unalive me. Everything is fenced, and I can't get a job that would cover my room's rent plus food and transportation. No one cleans up after their dogs, and that really bugs me. The biggest shock of all is how much of an alien I feel like. Even worse than when I first moved to the US. Sure makes me appreciate my time there a lot more. Okay, I'm sure this was an incredible experience for OP and everything, and yes, it was probably amazing experiencing America. But does this not just sound like, I don't know, like American written fan fiction of someone coming to America? Like this, just this post alone sounds like the perfect ad for a tourism agency to the States. Or any like immigration encouraging materials, I don't know. OP wrote up a pretty convincing argument. If OP's not being paid to do that, then they should be. Story 12. Marrying into my wife's Mexican-American/Native American family. I come from a small white family. My wife's family is huge. At our wedding, I had 15 people attend, which was nearly my entire family. She had 200, which is only a small fraction. Those that didn't get invited were quite grumpy about not getting invited too. When I first met her extended family, I was overwhelmed. There were like 50 to 60 people at her grandma's house on Christmas. Some of her uncles didn't like how quiet I was being and started telling my wife, girlfriend at the time, how she needed to be careful of the quiet ones. And several of them took me aside to threaten me. Then, of course, I made a major faux pas. I refused food from her grandma. I've since learned that it would be better to just slap her in the face. It took me 10 years to undo that damage. I didn't win over her last uncle until I got absolutely tanked at his daughter's wedding reception, at which point he decided I wasn't just a stuffy white guy. Once my wife coached me on her culture, I was able to fit in better, asking for food, allowing the women to serve me and clean up after me, taking plates home when I leave, being more outgoing, etc. Now grandma calls me mijo and introduces me to everyone as her grandson, which earns her a lot of confused looks. Since her grandma has accepted me, everyone else has too, and according to my in-laws, I'm Mexican now. All in all, would do again. But it would have been nice to know that what's rude on the white side of my family is endearing on my Mexican side and vice versa. Story 13. My parents were the typical Asian kind, hard to please and difficult to impress. When I graduated class valedictorian for 6th grade, my mother complained that I didn't receive any other award, like Best in Science or Best in Math. When I fell down the ranks of top students, I was still in the top 10 though, in my defense. My father told me that the reason he stopped attending school events was because he was ashamed of me. When my elder sister got pregnant a couple of months before graduating med school, my mom stopped talking to her for a month. They lived across the hall from each other, unforgiving of failures. That was the kind of parents that we had. When my girlfriend took her licensure exam for accountancy for the first time, she failed the test. I was with her when she told her parents about it. To this day, I still remember the shock I felt for what transpired that day. We were seated in her dorm. Me beside my girlfriend, and opposite us were her parents. She was finding it difficult to confess, and when the words, "I failed," finally came out, the first thing her father said was, "That's okay." Then my girlfriend started crying, and her parents consoled her. They were hugging and giving her words of encouragement, assuring her that everything will be all right, and that the thing to do is to move forward and try again. I just sat there watching them and feeling envious, thinking, this is what parents should be doing for their children. It came as a total shock to me, this level of openness and understanding. This kind of parent-child relationship was alien to me. I promised myself that if I were to become a father, I would be just like her parents. I don't hate my parents, though. They weren't bad people. They just had ridiculously high expectations of their kids. My siblings and I had a happy childhood for the most part. Sometimes we would sit and talk about how crazy our parents are and laugh a lot. Ugh, and I just know that if OP tells a story like this to his parents, then the parents will just be like, well, you know why she failed, right? Because her parents weren't hard enough on her. If they were harder on her, then she wouldn't have failed, because that's the kind of logic that those kind of tiger parents use. I'm glad OP seems dedicated to breaking the generational trauma, though. I don't know if that's the right term. It doesn't feel like heavy enough to be called generational trauma, but in a way I feel like it is. Either way, I'm glad OP saw something else, assessed how they felt about it, and is like, yes, that's how I'm gonna do things. Story 14. When I got my first teaching job, I had moved from northeastern Pennsylvania to southern Arizona. I rented a house with my husband and another couple. The house was huge. Absolute insanity for what we paid for it. When my students found out I lived in a 2-story house, they were all in disbelief. I was told that only rich people lived in 2-story houses, because no one can afford the AC bill in the summer. In my defense, I was making around $29K a year, and paying for a cross-country move, so definitely not rich, but it really put my students' level of poverty smack dab in front of my face. Story 15. There are a few, so I will list them in chronological order. The buildings full of bullet holes and the warning signs for mines in Bosnia. Such a contrast with the beautiful nature and mountains they have there. The hectic life in the central square of Morocco. Oh, and the fully veiled women, you could only see the eyes, asking if you wanted a tattoo. Buses in Santo Domingo that had no doors, and the feeling of being carefully watched at all times in the Dominican Republic. Also, the heavy contrast between the rich and the poor. Within 10 kilometers, I saw restaurants with Rolls Royces, lobsters, private jets, and then slums made of corrugated iron and children without any clothes around. And finally, poverty and the trash in Haiti. Story 16. Trying to cross the street in Hanoi, Vietnam. You can spot someone who just got in a mile away because the look of apprehension and confusion on their face as they figure out how to do it. There are very few crosswalks with walk signs. In most places, you look for a gap in the traffic and go. In Bangkok, you just make sure the flow of traffic would have time to stop before they hit you, and you just go and maintain a constant pace. In Hanoi, especially near the French Quarter, you just slowly walk into traffic. There are no gaps. You can sort of put your hand out to let people know you're going, but you just kind of maintain a slow, inching, walking pace and traffic will part around you. Scary as hell the first time. Story 17. A few years back, our family went to Japan for a family trip. We were in a restaurant and my dad tipped our waitress while we were leaving. About 5 minutes after we left, we saw our waitress running down the street. She handed our money back to us. We were all confused. So my dad tried to hand the tip back to her. She wouldn't take the money and ran back to the restaurant. We didn't realize this, but tipping is considered rude in Japan. Ah, the magic of places that pay their servers proper wages. Isn't that crazy? Gotta be honest, America, or at least North America. The things you do right, they're not bad. This one, you goofed. Story 18. Mine are gonna seem a bit mild compared to others, I'm sure, but I got two. A. My family moved to one of the richer towns in the US for a couple of years. Median household income there was $120,000. It's not just that every kid had a car once they got into junior high of high school. The majority of kids got brand new cars. I'm talking current year Hondas or Fords, as high school kids. Obviously, the vast majority of these kids got help from their parents to get these. And I thought I was lucky because my mom gave me her 13-year-old Camry for free when she bought another car. I mean, I was lucky, but just making some comparison. All these people lived in homes with at least 3,000 square feet. All had second homes somewhere else in the country, and they wore North Face jackets and had designer clothes. B. While living there, our family decided to join a church. We aren't really religious, but we wanted to become more integrated. Anyway, this church did a mission trip a couple hundred miles away to the Appalachian Mountains region. There we spent time fixing homes for people who couldn't afford to do it themselves. Going here was easily just as much of a culture shock. There were no public services in these towns. People burned their trash. One dude's house we were fixing had a hole in the floor that went straight down to the dirt underneath. He made about $1,000 a year on Social Security. He supplemented this with a meager inheritance from his mother. Overall, the towns we were volunteering in were almost entirely poor. Characteristic of the area, there were also massive drug problems. So that opened my eyes in a different way than above. I just don't understand how the same country can have such wealth and such squalor only a couple hundred miles apart. Most don't comprehend the difference because they don't get to see it themselves. They usually only see one side. I went on exchange to Chile recently, and to be honest, the conditions in some parts of that developing country were exactly the same as the conditions in the United States, which claims to be fully developed.